Hi, I'm Josh, and I'm so grateful that you've decided to join me as I talk about some games that excite me. At the time this video is going up, there's a game on Kickstarter called Arydia, The Paths We Dare Tread, designed by Cody Miller and published by Far Off Games. This is a game I've been watching for a very long time. Going way back to 2013, I kickstarted Cody's first game design called Zia, Legends of a Drift System. It was a big open world 4X space game that was a lot of fun to play. And sometime after that, Cody first announced Arydia, and that was probably a few years ago already, and I've been following it closely ever since. Now that it's finally up on Kickstarter, I want to compare it to a couple of other games. I want to compare it to Gloomhaven, because Gloomhaven is another huge game that I kickstarted some years back that became my #1 favorite game of all time. And I also want to compare it to Dungeons and Dragons, because, well, that'll become pretty clear as we go through this video. One thing I want to make clear right now is that this is not a sponsored video in any way. I haven't received anything from Far Off Games or Cody for doing this video. This is just something I'm doing out of my own interest. So let's get into it. This video is basically just going to be a fairly high-level overview of several different categories as we compare these three games. I'm not going to be diving into the specifics of rules or anything like that. I'm just going to be taking a look at how these three games compare to each other in different categories. The first thing I should mention is my own personal experience with each of these three games. So I do play Dungeons and Dragons. I am a player. I also have dabbled a bit with DMing. I am actually getting ready to dive into my very first campaign as a dungeon master. Previously, I've just done kind of one-offs and that sort of thing. And so I have experience on both sides of the equation, both as a player and as a dungeon master. In terms of my experience with Gloomhaven here, like I said, I kickstarted the original Gloomhaven game way back in 2015, and I've played through the entire base game campaign. Through 61 plays, we got through the entire base game, and then just started to dabble into the Forgotten Circles expansion. Like I said, it became my #1 ranked game of all time. After I finished the base game campaign, I did create a video talking about my experiences with Gloomhaven and my thoughts after completing the campaign. You can check out that video. I'll put it up here, and I'll probably link it at the end of this video too if you want to check that out. As for Arydia, I have watched some long videos about the gameplay. The first was a 2-hour video that was posted on a channel called One Stop Co-op Shop Streamed, and that dove into the basic gameplay of the game. Then I followed up with part 2, which was another hour-long video that was posted on their One Stop Co-op Shop channel, and it got into some spoiler territory of the game. I've also downloaded and read through the rulebook, which is a 92-page document. But don't be too worried. There's a lot of pictures and blank space in that document, so the actual rule book, when it gets printed, I'm sure is not going to be 92 pages. Not to worry about that. We'll get into the actual game rules just from an overview perspective, not in sort of any detail. But I have watched these lengthy game playthroughs and read through that rule book, and so I feel like I have a pretty good grasp on how the game comes together, and spoiler alert, I think it's going to be an amazingly fun game. So to get into the comparisons, let's start with the theme. Dungeons and Dragons is based on classic fantasy. Your sort of typical Tolkien style fantasy is what the D&D world was based on. When Gloomhaven came along, they decided to sort of do their own thing and create their own fantasy world and fantasy races. And normally, I'm not necessarily a huge fan of that. I do really like the classic fantasy. So there's something about the familiar dwarves and elves and goblins and orcs that really kind of makes me happy. And so I don't always love it when games go off and do their own thing that's not familiar to me, but with Gloomhaven, the world they created really worked well. The characters and the races are just also interesting, so Gloomhaven did something a bit different. With Arydia, they went back to the classic fantasy template, and I'm glad they did. It looks like just kind of a bright, fun fantasy world. Doesn't get as dark as Gloomhaven, just from the initial overviews I've seen. And I like that they are sticking with the familiar old classic fantasy. In terms of the type of games we have, Dungeons and Dragons is obviously a role-playing game. It is not a board game per se. It is a tabletop game, obviously, but it's more of a role-playing experience where the action of the game is talked through rather than played out in detail with a ton of game components. Gloomhaven is a legacy-style adventure game in that as you progress through the campaign and work through the connected story that's woven throughout the game, you make permanent changes to the game. You apply stickers on cards and boards, and you actually make changes to the game that cannot be reversed, which is what makes it a legacy-style game. Now, Arydia is claiming to be a green legacy game in that the changes that are made to the game are not permanent. They can all be reset and started from the beginning again, which in my mind makes it not a legacy game. The whole thing with legacy is that the permanent changes you're making are what makes legacy mean something and gives so much weight to a player's choices, because you know that these decisions cannot be reversed. This whole green legacy idea is just, to me, another word for a campaign game. And there's nothing at all wrong with that. I love campaign games. It's just that I don't like the word legacy being applied to it, because permanent changes are not made in Arydia, which for a lot of people is going to be a really good thing. Now, in terms of the rules as a whole, Dungeons and Dragons can be a little intimidating to get into due to the sheer volume of rules. As a completely open-ended role-playing experience, really anything that is in the player's imagination could end up happening in the game, and so you need quite a large template of rules to cover any eventualities that might come up during the gameplay. So there is quite a large volume of rules. When you look through the player handbook, for instance, it's quite a thick book. There's a lot going on in there, and so it's not necessarily the easiest thing to learn. Gloomhaven 2 here has a large rule book. It has a large volume of rules, but it also has a lot of complexity. Even after 61 plays of the game, I can't tell you with 100% certainty that I'm playing everything absolutely correctly in the game, especially when it comes to monster activations and the AI system of the monsters. So it is a game that has a lot of rules and a lot of complexity. It's a tough game to get into, but as with anything, once you do get into it, it starts to become kind of second nature. Arydia, on the other hand, feels very intuitive. After watching these gameplay videos and after reading through the rulebook, I feel pretty confident that I could set up the game right now and just dive right into it with only an occasional reference to the rulebook. There's something about it, especially as a role player, that feels easy to grasp and easy to understand, so I don't think there should be any issues with the rules of the game for Arydia. Moving on to the sort of general structure of the games, Dungeons and Dragons inhabits a large zoomed out world that you adventure through, and that you kind of zoom in on the fine details when there's some kind of an encounter that happens, which more often than not is a combat experience. At that point, you kind of zoom into the nitty gritty of movement and taking turns and that sort of thing, and then when it's done, you kind of zoom back out to the world as a whole again. In Gloomhaven, we typically would start out in town. Then we would travel out to a location to play out a scenario, which is always some kind of combat experience. And then after the combat has been finished, we would travel back to town and do some more town actions again. With Arydia, it is very much similar to Dungeons and Dragons in terms of going from that zoomed out experience to zooming into the details for the combat, and then going back out to adventure mode again. Arydia claims to be built on 4 pillars that are exploration, progression, combat, and role-playing. And these are things we're going to get into as the video progresses here. Now, one aspect that is important to all 3 of these games is storytelling. In Dungeons & Dragons, the storytelling is guided by the DM. The framework is sort of created by the campaign and led by the Dungeon Master, but the details are filled out by the players as the game is played. In Gloomhaven, each combat scenario opens with several paragraphs of the ongoing story that's happening, though the whole overarching narrative I didn't find to be the strong point of the game. The real strong point of Gloomhaven was the gameplay itself. Arydia, again, is more comparable to D&D in that you are meeting characters, non-player characters, you're having events, and you're interacting with the world in a way that a story is going to be told. And what's really interesting about it is that there are opportunities for a very guided style of role-playing, in that when you have a NPC character, there will be acting prompts on the card. For instance, it'll say the demeanor of this character is gruff. They are doing the actions of rubbing their hands. There will be verbal text in quotes where you'll read what the character is actually saying, and then in brackets you'll have the actions that the character is doing while they're saying that, such as stand up and bow would be one example of an action. So the cards themselves really give players an easy time of role-playing, because it really guides you on how to talk for the character, even the actions you can perform as you're speaking for the character, and it really takes players by the hand and makes the role-playing aspect of it super easy, and I feel sort of takes a lot of the pressure out of that experience. Another super interesting thing about Arydia, as the story progresses, the state of the NPC characters will change. For instance, if you interact with the character in a certain way, you might draw a different card that's the same character but who is now in a different state. And it's the same with some locations, where you will interact with the location, perhaps change it in such a way that, once again, you have to draw a different tile or card to replace the location with the new state that you've created by interacting with it, which I think is really interesting. Now, all three games have a large world that players travel through and have these largely combat experiences. So in Dungeons and Dragons, as you're traveling, you might roll up an encounter and have something happen as you're kind of getting to the location you're going to. It doesn't necessarily always happen. In Gloomhaven, when you travel to a new location to have a combat scenario, you do have to draw a travel card, which will more often than not give players a choice of ways to interact with the encounter and perhaps even affect the characters as they go into this combat scenario. Arydia has a very interesting deck of travel cards that, if you want to travel far, involves kind of a simple push your luck mechanism, where you're flipping up cards and trying not to get the same symbol come up more than once, depending on how you're traveling. So you can't just bounce all over the world at will. There is a cost to traveling in terms of risking becoming exhausted. So it's kind of an interesting little system. Next up is the decision making, the strategy, and the tactics. Now, none of these three games are highly strategic games in terms of coming up with some grand overarching strategy. Instead, they're highly tactical in terms of just responding to the ever-changing situation that players encounter. In D&D, there is some decision making regarding where to go and what to do. When it comes to combat, there's some simple tactics involved with deciding what weapons and spells to utilize, but it's largely hoping that you roll well, to be honest. Gloomhaven, this is where Gloomhaven really shines. It is a highly tactical game. Every decision you make during these combat scenarios feels so difficult. There's a lot to consider as you're playing through a scenario of Gloomhaven, and it really gets the brain going. So it is a very well designed game from this tactical combat perspective. Arydia, once again, is more along the lines of Dungeons and Dragons, but it is a little bit more tactical in terms of its combat. The combat is built around a kind of unique location system and weapon system, where each individual monster will have a pattern of hit points on it, and then the weapons the characters are carrying have patterns of striking. So if you can match up the patterns of striking that your weapons do to the pattern of hit points on the monsters, you can sort of try to most efficiently take down the monsters with how you're striking them with your weapons. So it looks interesting, but I don't feel that the decision space is very deep. A lot of the choices that you're going to do there seem like there's kind of a most obvious route to take in terms of how you're striking the monster with the weapon you have, and it just doesn't look like there's a lot of depth in terms of just the very basic beginning of the game overviews I've seen. Now, that doesn't mean that the game might not expand and become much more complex and involved. I have no idea, obviously, based on just the initial playthroughs that I've seen of the very start of the game. So this is just based on an impression of what I've seen of a very limited amount of gameplay. Arydia's combat also, just like D&D, is very much based on rolling a d20, which brings back memories of Zia that I wasn't too fond with. I thought Zia was a really interesting and fun game that was hampered a bit by an over-reliance on dice rolling. The very first thing that we had to house rule in Zia was the roll and move system, for instance. So the D20, when I saw that, I was initially leery, but it doesn't actually seem too bad because many of the rolls seem to have a lesser effect and a greater effect, with kind of a natural 1 being a miss and a higher roll having a stronger effect. So it's not like you have a whole range from 1 to 20 of things that could happen. It's more like a coin flip where the coin is heavily weighted to maybe one side than the other. And in that sense, it doesn't seem that there's a massive reliance on luck. The next thing we'll look at is exploration. In Dungeons and Dragons, you do have an opportunity to do some exploring, although the directions you can go are limited based on the campaign that the DM is running. Obviously, you can't have just a limitless open world because the Dungeon Master could never prepare for that many choices. There are different routes you can go, usually a fork in the road where you might go one direction or another, but there's not necessarily a huge decision space in terms of exploration with D&D. Gloomhaven didn't have a huge aspect of exploration either. As you completed scenarios, they would kind of unlock other scenarios, and typically you might have 3 or 4 scenarios available at any one moment that you could go to. As you completed some scenarios, more would open up, and each scenario kind of followed a different plot line to a certain extent too, so that was kind of the extent of exploration in Gloomhaven. Arydia, on the other hand, seems to be first and foremost an open-world adventure game of exploration and discovery. The world is out there in a complete format, and it just needs to be discovered. All the locations and the things you'll find at the locations are preset and they're out there to be discovered, but how you interact with each location and character is up to the players. I like this non-random aspect of exploration in comparison to Tales of the Arabian Nights, for instance, where you could pretty much go anywhere and do anything. I didn't enjoy that game because there wasn't a cohesive narrative being told. It was just a completely random, this happens and this happens and this happens, whereas in Arydia, it does appear that there is an overarching story to the game that is there to be discovered, that is not random, but can differ from playgroup to playgroup depending on decisions that are made. So I think that looks really cool. The last comparison we'll take a look at is loot and leveling up. So in D&D, often players will gain money as rewards for completing interactions, and occasionally they'll get some special items of some sort. And of course there are lots of opportunities for character customization as they level up. Depending on your character class, there are choices to be made as you gain experience and use that experience to level up. Gloomhaven is very much the same thing. You collect coins as you progress through a scenario. You occasionally find a special item, and again, the opportunities for customizing your character are something that really excites me about Gloomhaven too. There are so many choices you make each time you level up that can really change the direction you take with your character. It can really change how you play them in the future. And Arydia also is kind of the same thing too, where often you'll gain money as rewards for combat. Sometimes you'll get a special item out of a treasure chest. And then when it comes time to spend your experience points to level up, there is a lot of variability with how you can select the character's new stats and the new skills that you give them. These skills in particular, I think, are what is going to make the decision making of combat a little bit more interesting. I mentioned that I didn't feel that the decision space looked all that deep, but the skills you gain as you progress, I think, can add some interesting choices to your character in combat and expand that decision tree. Arydia also has some interesting rules with how items are equipped and carried that I find is a lot more realistic than D&D. In D&D, a character can carry so much gear. It would be funny to do a video where you actually got all the gear that a D&D character carries and tried to go on a hike with it. It would be pretty difficult, I think. In Arydia, you are very limited to how you carry things based on the location you're carrying them, with armor being worn on the body, weapons being held in hands, and so forth. It does really kind of make you choose how you're going to equip and enhance your character. So my conclusions for Arydia. The game looks amazing. I've spoken his praises throughout this video here. One thing that does really concern me, though, is that it is in desperate need of an editor. The components that I've seen, as few of them as I've seen in the playthroughs and in the rulebook, they're just chock full of spelling errors and typos. I'll show some of them on the screen here. I won't go through all of them specifically. These aren't all the errors that I encountered as I was watching the playthroughs and reading the rulebook. I really do hope they hire an actual editor to go through it and correct all this stuff here, because that can really take a player out of the game when they're running across a lot of simple errors during the gameplay. But here's what Arydia is from my point of view. Arydia is Dungeons and Dragons where the game itself is the DM and where the role-playing is heavily guided by the game. It's obviously been very heavily influenced by D&D, and I think it's pretty exciting that you can have a similar experience but without having a DM. I know that in my limited experience as a DM, it's kind of a stressful position to take. To do it well, you do have to put a lot of work into prepping it, which isn't all that fun. But if you can have the game itself take on that role of the DM, then it frees up the players to just get in there and play and enjoy the experience. So my final question, with the game being on Kickstarter at the moment, as of posting this video, is it worth the cost? So the all-in experience for the game is $190 US, and then shipping to Canada is another $25 US. When I add that up and convert it to Canadian dollars, that comes out to $272 at minimum. I don't know if I would also get dinged for duty, which has resulted in unpleasant surprises in the past. Here's a hot tip: if you're ever shipping from US to Canada, do it via USPS, don't use UPS. That's when I tend to get dinged with the really harsh duty fees. But I'm looking at $272 minimum for the game, and I just can't do it. I'm 100% reliant on a disability income to get by. I became disabled from my job as a paramedic due to Crohn's disease and PTSD, and so I'm trying to get by on a disability income, and $272 for a game, no matter how amazing it looks, is just something I can't do. I thought about contacting Cody and saying, hey, I've done a bit of copy editing for game rule books and for a couple of college textbooks. Can I offer my services as an editor to correct all these mistakes in exchange for a copy of the game? But there are kind of two problems with that. The first is that I don't know if the copy of the game would be really worth all the many hours that we go into editing, which is a job that requires a lot of concentration. Because of the human brain's way of automatically correcting mistakes, you really have to focus on what you're doing to catch these little spelling errors and typos and stuff. And the other thing is, I would spoil myself on the entire contents of the game in order to get myself a copy of the game, which seems slightly counterproductive, so I don't know that that would be a great trade-off. I think that my only hope is this gift certificate that I have from my friendly local game store. I don't know if Arydia will even show up in retail stores or if it's going to be a strictly Kickstarter thing. And I don't know if I want to hang on to my gift certificate that I got as a gift from a bunch of family members for my birthday for the next year and a half until the game does come out. But again, this is all very much based on my own personal financial situation. Yours is going to be much different. The way you value this game based on your own income is going to be obviously a different experience to mine. And this game has been a huge success on Kickstarter. They're well over $1 million in terms of the dollars raised, so there are plenty of people out there purchasing Arydia. I'm just disappointed because of how long I've been following the game and how long I've been excited about it. And because of the fact that when I think about who I can play it with, I don't have a lot of friends at this point because of my PTSD and social anxiety, but the few friends I do have, I feel like I could play Arydia with any of them because it does seem so approachable and so fun as a game of exploration and narrative storytelling. So what about you? What do you think about Arydia based on what you've seen up to this point? Are you gonna put your money down and pick up a copy of the game? I'd really love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And I hope you found this video to be helpful. Regardless, I appreciate you watching it. The preceding video has been brought to you free of charge by me, Josh. The only thing I ask in return is that you could do one of the following: give me a thumb up, push the subscribe button, or share the link to this video with somebody who you think would enjoy it. Cheers! and it was a very good game of space. It was a great game. It was a really fun game. The first thing I should mention is my experience, the first thing I should mention is my own personal experience, which kind of in Gloomhaven, scenario, and these are things we're going to get into throughout. There will be verbal text and quote that's instead they are very highly tactic. Each individual, I don't, it just in terms of exploit, and hey, I've done a bit of basic editing. I've done a bit of, because of the brain, because of the mind's picking.